Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's such a thrill.
Great to sit
Happy
down
to be
with
with you.
So
Yeah.
I actually was introduced to you, even the possibility of you doing this, just through a really cool set of kind of podcast episodes you had done with Tripp, just on his homebrewed Christianity kind of. You guys had done a whole series on walking with Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard, which was really helpful to a lot of people. So thank you for doing that. And that's an online resource. Did you have some fun? It seemed like you guys had a lot of fun.
It was a pleasure. Oh my gosh. I mean, Tripp Fuller, if your audience said no, I mean, this is a guy who you could hand him a spoon and an empty room, and he's going to somehow make a game out of it. Like he makes everything fun, high energy, and which is also cool because it allows me to sound like the serious one, which almost never in any interview is true. But whenever Tripp and I are bouncing ideas off each other, I end up sounding like the serious academic and he's the play one.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had a ball. We had nearly 3,000 people in that online pop-up community, did 6 weeks on Kierkegaard and engaged his thought very heavily relative to, so what does it mean to live Christianly in the world today? How do we rethink, debates that maybe Kierkegaard invites us into, whether or not we follow Kierkegaard in the answers to some of those debates? He raises them in the right ways. Thought a lot about, his critique of Christian nationalism, what that says to us now in a sort of post-Trump model of white evangelicalism. How does Kierkegaard offer visions of what it looks like to think about justice and yet maybe push Kierkegaard a little bit on his, I think, lackluster notions of community. So it was a ball. We had a great time. And as a result of that little, pop-up community, I kind of hit the podcast circuit and did a lot of interviews on why Kierkegaard is relevant to the contemporary world, and have heard just, sustained good feedback about those ideas and what it was that Tripp and I were trying to launch. And so it's led to a book I'm now writing, slower than I wish it were, but a book tentatively titled Camping with Kierkegaard. And the whole idea of it is, how do we kind of, not read Kierkegaard for the sake of being good Kierkegaardians, but how do we try to live well as responsible adults in a world that is defined by misinformation, chaos, threats, neighbor hatred, and animosity in light of a kind of, model of individualistic capitalism? How is it that we're supposed to then be good humans to each other? And I think Kierkegaard can maybe speak into that. But I also think going camping and trout fishing speaks to that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to kind of bring those together and see what happens with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So help us out a little bit. You're an avid outdoors person. You are you're someone that loves biking, that has an enthusiasm for nature that I think is not just tangible. I know some people are like, oh well, he's an outdoor guy, and just describe a little bit of that for us. You're in South Carolina. You are mining the outdoors of South Carolina, trout fishing, biking, hiking. Go through it, man. What excites you about that stuff before we dive into some philosophy stuff? What do you like about nature? And
this is the fun stuff. So I was born in Cleveland, Tennessee, which is Southeast Tennessee, right kind of at the North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee kind of, border, but grew up in Florida. And so I grew up, doing beach volleyball and, bass fishing, but it never quite felt right. The way I describe it is that Florida always feels squishy, right? It doesn't feel solid. You know? Imagine how Nietzsche would be different if he had been in Florida rather than the Alps. I'm pretty sure his philosophy would have been way less compelling. Now, I should say, in due respect to my friend Aaron James and others who are beach people, man, they mine that space and do it really well. And it is baller when they talk about finding the flow with the waves and, rethinking our economic lives and slowing down and adapting to what the, beach offers. So that's awesome. And so people like my wife, she wants flip-flops and sand and thinks mountains are in the way. Right. So there's two different kind of views here, but I'm a mountain guy. And so after growing up in Florida, man, getting back to the mountains for me, it's solid. every view is different. When you're driving through Iowa, it's just more corn and more corn, right? So it feels claustrophobic. It's like I could drive 9 hours and I'm still in corn.
Right.
In the mountains, every turn, every trail, every twist of the river, it's just always new and novel and interesting. No matter how many waterfalls I have hiked to, man, like I can't wait to see the next one, right? So yeah, I do a lot of trout fishing. I actually took my job at Furman to do trout fishing in Western North Carolina, and got my PhD largely to go trout fishing because my dad's a professor and he trout fishes a lot. So I was like, man, that's a good job. I'll do that, right? I didn't understand tenure and books and promotion and stuff.
That's right.
So I haven't fished as much as I wish I had. But then during COVID, I realized, wow, what would you do? And this is a good question for everybody. What would you do if you had a year to two where you couldn't do the stuff that you normally feel like you ought to do? Right? Where it's, oh, well, I can't get to the office. I can't get to church. I can't get to, whatever it is, the community basketball game, whatever. Can't go watch March Madness with my friends at the, wing shop. What would I do? And for me, it turns out the answer was everything that was COVID safe. I could be by myself in the mountains in my Tacoma lifted 4x4 with a bike rack on the back and a trout rod in the bed. Like, man, I can do all this. And so what happened was this real, oh man, like despite the trauma and indescribable horror of the pandemic, it was also this moment where like American capitalistic rat race just broke. And, and I recognize my privilege in being able to say this, right? I wasn't an essential worker who was having to deliver double shifts to be able to provide. And thank God for those people, or the rest of us couldn't have managed it. But man, I spent a lot of time in the woods and got into mountain biking, which is something I hadn't done when I was, really since college, and loved it. And so I'm now, biking 4 or 5 days a week. And, any day I've got the full day, I'm heading to the mountains with a trout rod. Next week, my dad and I are doing a guided trout float trip together up in Northeast Tennessee. And yeah, for me, I guess the connection to theology or religious existence, when we think that what it means to be in relation to God is tantamount to being a member of a church, what can sometimes happen is the relationship to yourself and your relationship to your neighbors become mediated via the institution of the church, right? And I don't think that's the right way to understand it. I tend to think of the church as the community that is resulting from mediating the relation to yourself and others via God. And being in the mountains for me makes that connection to God and others actually much more profound, much more tangible. And it also reminds me in a kind of sublime way that like vulnerability is real. And of course, we all know that in light of the pandemic and the heroic people standing in Ukraine facing, overwhelming odds. But man, you slip off a rock in a whitewater stream trying to fish one little hole and suddenly you're going under. Like you're aware of, I need to get firm footing, right? I need to be real careful about where I'm at and why I'm at. And is this risk worth it? Or you're going down a mountain biking trail and you hit a jump that's bigger than you thought it was, figuring out, all right, how am I going to adjust my body in the air to try to, not run into a tree on the landing. And there's something about that that then also makes you start thinking, this is not just for me. It's not about just me getting to the wood. It's also about, I want whatever this experience is for others to be what we're invested in making possible, right? If it's the beach for somebody, if it's, the small book group, if it's the craft beer, whatever the thing is, like, how is it we're invested in everybody finding those moments where they're able to say, yeah, this is good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know.
You're a conservationist, man. You're starting to sound like a Ducks Unlimited president or something.
I am definitely a fan of saying,
yeah.
Even though I'm a very hardcore progressive politically, I think we need to conserve what it looks like to say use is not using up.
Yeah.
And narratives of scarcity tend to only benefit those who are profiting off of it. Mm-hmm. What if we started thinking of narratives of plenitude? Right. There, you know,
man, we better not get into fossil fuels or this will go 3 hours, bro.
Especially and I should make very
gas
clear
prices climbing.
That does not, none of that opens onto health and wealth plenitude. Just for any listener who might be confused, it's more about saying, hey, my world is not made smaller because someone else's is made bigger.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Right.
That's
Ben
good.
Folds has that great song, There's Always Someone Cooler Than You.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he says, you don't have to, make yourself big by making them small. And that's what, when I'm in the mountains, man, like I always feel small,
totally.
And it allows me to be like, God, this is cool. How is it that I can get out of the way of other people who are trying to find, their flourishing and their bliss?
Yeah.
So.
That's kind of a weird, but I mean, it's weird how many sermons go off on Old Testament figures and then actually do the actual opposite, right? Like they make them big, then put us in their place, and now we're the rock star of the show. We're King David. And it's about living Solomonic, like larger than life. We don't want to get into that either, but man, that's good. Your concern for the other. We'll get into that with your book a little bit, but that is refreshing. I think that's something that philosophers should be and need to be doing. What else is there, right? Like we're here to create those sorts of environments for others. And if others can flourish, man, we've done something pretty important. And so
pretty cool. And this is where, of course, it's been so interesting to watch. I mean, again, there's always, it's like you always need, especially as an academic, to have a asterisk or a caveat or a footnote. Whenever you say something is really impressive, there's always the footnote saying, and it's of course still based on narratives of privilege and exclusion. Like, all of that remains true. But man, it has been exciting to see, during the pandemic, the Italians singing out of their windows to each other and creating community.
Yes.
And it's been so exciting to see in the midst of heartbreak of the Ukrainian invasion, like all of the countries around, saying, come in, this great Doridian, yes, come, right? And of course, again, they didn't say that as well when Syria needed it. Right. So we can recognize there's still lots of problems.
Yeah.
But humans can find ways not to be defined by egoism and greed. They can also be defined by hospitality and, what I would describe as a logic of kenosis, saying, look, it ain't about my place in the sun. Yeah. It's about recognizing the sun shines on a lot of places. And so how do we get others out of the shade?
Yeah.
And
that's good, man. Hey, there's some female theologians that are all over that topic. I mean, I'll give a shout out to one. Christine Pohl Asbury has been writing on hospitality for better part of 4 decades. Her stuff's incredible. I mean, Making Room should be required reading in every 18-year-old's. I mean, it's just amazing.
Absolutely.
It's like the Christian tradition started with hospitality. We got to get back to it.
I also recommend Wendy Farley has a book called Gathering Those Who Are Driven Away. And it's all about what would it look like if, the church was no longer defined by excluding, the LGBTQ community or, whoever it is that's historically not been invited. And what if we instead say, no, let's gather back the ones that we've pushed out.
Wow.
And Wendy's work is really, really, really impressive on that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we'll get into some fun topics. So just some softballs here. Why should Christians get involved in philosophy? Just in general, why should Christians be in the discipline?
I would say because Christians are humans most of the time, and philosophy is at its most basic an attempt to put question marks where society hands us periods. And so if we're going to live reflectively, if we're going to live on purpose, we should love wisdom and realize that wisdom is not about having some truth that we hold, It's about being opened onto the idea that truth is probably more than we know. And this should humble us in the task of truth seeking. So why should Christians do philosophy? Because they are humans, and humans should love truth and wisdom and then have the humility to seek it, because that's what then makes life, more appropriately worth living.
Well, I mean, you're starting to sound like the wisdom tradition in the Old Testament, which I think is actually addresses a lot of that in kind of pre-rational, pre-enlightenment ways or whatever.
That's right.
So give us a basic rundown. When most Christians think of philosophy, I think there's this tendency to go, oh, well, it's apologetics.
Yeah.
Those are not the same thing. Please just give us a quick definition that kind of just delineates where the ground that those two kind of cover is.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So philosophy, you can understand it in two ways. The way I understand it when I say, well, why should Christians care? I don't think that all Christians should be professional philosophers, right? Any more than I think, all Christians should be professional plumbers. I do think probably all Christians, as people who live in houses, should know how to, tighten a sink faucet when it's leaking, right?
Yeah.
And then call a professional if it turns out it's bigger than that or more complicated than that. So philosophy understood as this Aristotelian, wonder-induced love of wisdom, that I think all of us should be game for. And what that then means, I'll give you a couple of practical examples, then we'll look at the professional side. Practically, what this means is that we are appropriately suspicious of narratives of truth that seem to be reinforcing the interests of the powerful. Now, does that mean that we're doing complicated hermeneutics and digging? No, it just means we care about evidence. And we think arguments matter, and we're committed to some kind of basic notion of public reason that hey, if you're going to hold a view that implicates other people, you should have good reasons for this. And we should be able to talk about that. And criticism is not something that means I hate you. Right? That's what I mean by we should all be philosophers in that sense. The best book I can recommend on that kind of view, and it's available to everybody, it's accessible. It's by two friends of mine, Scott Aiken and Rob Talese, wrote a book called Why We Argue and How We Should. And the whole thing is about, hey, what you see on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, that ain't argument, right? That's theater.
Yep.
The world is not made better by that. The world is made better when people at dinner tables and bar stools and small groups and walking on nature trails can think together about what makes life enjoyable. What should we care about? What should we value? What are the kinds of policies in society that enable flourishing among people that we may even disagree with in other ways? We should get good at that. So in that sense, philosophy in this, let's call it everyday notion, it's not something technical that requires training in philosophy. It requires humility to recognize the set of things that you hold most true. It's cool if you throw some question marks next to those. Does it mean that now you're throwing out those commitments? It just means you're saying, but what if I'm wrong? What would change? Am I open to being wrong about this? And then maybe you come down and say, yeah, I still think this is the right way. Cool. Right. But that's what opens up that hospitality in the context of engagement. But then there's another notion of philosophy. And that's what professionals do, right? That's where we don't just take an intro to philosophy course in college and then go become engineers or physicians or whatever. This is where we go get PhDs in philosophy. And I don't think that is for everybody. Not because it's this elitist discourse only for the talented. Right. It's just because, it might be something that actually is less productive or less conducive to the social flourishing and human good that the everyday philosophy actually facilitates.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I used to love poetry. I mean, I still love poetry, but I used to love it until I took a lot of advanced graduate courses on things like, literary criticism. And it kind of wrecked my joy.
Yeah.
I couldn't read anymore without these
Mhm.
layers. And, I was like, man, but I just want to read like Whitman say,
Mhm.
oh, to sing of joys. Right.
Yeah.
And it was now, but wait a minute, his joys were
Mhm.
nested in the Eurocentric
Mhm.
conception of capitalistic privilege. And
Right.
I am sympathetic to all those critiques, but it
Mhm.
did kind of rob some of the, can't we just engage each other? Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's important. Iggy Pop says once that anarchy and nihilism are probably best left to professionals. I tend to think that's true when it comes to like complicated,
Mhm.
jargon-laden technical debates.
Mhm.
That stuff's probably not good on Facebook.
Mhm.
That's where you need pros who kind of are already abiding by a certain set of implicit
Right.
rules for how we do and what we do. And so apologetics, the problem with apologetics is there are also two versions.
Mhm.
There are popular apologetics,
Right.
which ostensibly sounds like a good idea, right?
Mhm.
Because that's just this public kind of intellectual, we're all doing philosophy and reflective and caring about arguments. And hey, aren't there some really good arguments for Christianity
Sure.
or for biblical truth or whatever? So it sounds really smart and reasonable. The problem is it's almost never deployed in ways that then are couched within the professional understanding of what it looks like to be really self-aware and humble about the deployment of arguments that now cultivate force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So when you're in churches, and I grew up in these spaces where we would have, like an apologetics weekend at church or something, right? Or, a 6-week session on Wednesday nights for apologetics. We'd, read Strobel's Case for Christ or Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict or whatever it is. And, again, it's not that these are bad things. Those people can make their cases and show why they are committed in certain ways. And maybe that's helpful for people wrestling with stuff. Problem is, it was not deployed in those spaces as, hey, here are some things we can wrestle with. It was deployed as, here's how you guard yourself against the attacks of this secular, humanist, pluralist world. And so when they hit you with evil, you go, boom, free will defense, baby. And you don't have to listen to them anymore. when they say, but what about all the people who have different religious commitments? You go, boom, exclusivist truth. But, and so it ends up actually being isolating, narrowing, and self-protective. And I'm not accusing Josh McDowell of, I don't know him, but the way that it gets appropriated and deployed, the Francis Schaeffers, even sadly, some of C.S. Lewis, who I don't think as a person was doing this, it gets taken up in white evangelical spaces as a way of actually not having to listen.
Yeah.
But then you got philosophers of religion. Now, I would not say they're doing apologetics in the sense of trying to contend for the truth of Christ. What I would say is they're doing philosophy of religion, and lots of them come down such that the better argument cuts in favor of theism than non-theism. And so that then is a kind of apologia, as Justin Martyr might talk about it, where what you're trying to do is get straight and clarify what you even hold to be true and why it matters and differentiate it from alternatives. In that sense, I'm all in on a professional version of apologetics. But if the goal is to basically do the work of conversionistic evangelization via philosophy, I think then you're not doing philosophy. You've already started at the end of things rather than continuing to recognize philosophy is about living reflectively and being humble while we do it. Doesn't mean you don't stand someplace, right? You can't stand on fences forever. Like I defended my work, determinate Christian commitments as reasonable in a postmodern space.
Sure.
A lot of people think that I am, narrow and self-protective because I'm like, nah, I'm just saying this is a reasonable place that someone could stand. I'm not trying to convince people who read this, therefore Christ. Right. And I'm cool if we do those things in the context of the conversations on the nature trails with our friends.
Yeah.
Right. This is what changed C.S. Lewis, was Tolkien walking and talking with him. And eventually he was compelled. But again, that apologetics isn't this kind of aggressive, on the offense, taking back the world. It's almost like popular apologetics has become like the, liberty debate team or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right? And I think actually it's not just dangerous. I think it is destructive to the life of invitation and humility and yet confidence that real Christian existence invites of us. So I think it's usually, when it's popularly done, it's usually bad philosophy and dangerous politics and disastrous theology. So
it's good.
Not to put too fine a point on it.
You said it. His address is one. No, I'm kidding.
I have written an essay called, what the heck was it called? I forget now. But it basically is defending. It's called Apologetics After Objectivity. And I'm a fan of apologetics if we mean this Justin Martyr sense,
right,
in light of a postmodern hermeneutic awareness, trying to invite neighbors to think better about stuff that really impacts the way we live together as social beings. Man, we should get good at that.
That's good.
I don't think the popular apologetics crowd is really being responsive to the kind of objections people like me would bring.
Sure.
Because I'm not their audience.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. That's right.
And yet, as pros in philosophy, I am the audience. And therefore, we're not writing books that are actually designed for small group studies on Tuesday nights. Right. I mean, you don't want to read Plantinga's modal ontological argument in the context of a church.
It is,
but somehow the popular apologist is citing Plantinga to defend their whatever.
Correct.
And you're like, but Plantinga's better than that.
For sure.
Right.
For sure.
So anyway.
Well, and so couple just quick pitches. One, source text, right? Like going back to that original text, read C.S. Lewis, like don't just read what somebody says about what he says and how he proves Christianity. Go read his books. They're amazing. I mean, he's got great arguments. He's not exactly what some people think he is, right? Like he can be kind of twisted and you're going, that's not really what he was saying. And
I was invited to keynote, or give one of the plenary sessions, I guess, at a C.S. Lewis conference a few years ago. But it wasn't academics. It was pastors and missional groups were coming together to kind of celebrate Lewis. And I got invited to speak. And I'd be happy to. And they said, what do you want to speak on? And I said, I want to speak on Lewis's universalism.
Yeah. Whoa, man.
I got disinvited.
Yeah, no doubt.
They uninvited me. And I was like, so you don't want to read Lewis. You want me to just deliver the evangelicalized Lewis, who actually is not in the pages of his texts. I'm not going to do that because I care about actually being a scholar. Now, there are scholars who hold those readings of Lewis, and we debate each other in professional ways.
Sure.
But when I'm talking to pastors, I'm actually trying to say, hey, y'all, what if we recognize this other lens here? Then Lewis looks a lot more like Rob Bell, and y'all are burning Bell's books.
Yeah. No,
maybe you should slow your roll.
Yes,
folks,
I mean, C.S. Lewis is that's its own topic. I mean, I think the other thing I want to mention is just while you were talking, I thought of the Road to Emmaus story, which I think is actually really important in philosophy. The way that people recognize Jesus post resurrection is actually they kind of just travel with him along a road. Yeah. And then, he reveals himself, but it is in that kind of encounter with the other that I think is, it's reflected in the Good Samaritan story. It's reflected all over the Old Testament. When we charitably encounter others in a very theological way, in a respectful way. And so this is kind of a Martin Buber pitch too, but when you encounters the other as the thou, you do encounter Christ. You are providing cups of cold water and you're putting clothes on him and feeding him. And those are important ways of wrestling with what God means in this culture. But
that of course strikes at odds with the way that so much of broadly speaking, white conservative American evangelicalism has understood Christian identity as a combative, oppositional force, which is anchored in an authoritative conception of God. And if anybody wants to see how this plays out, my buddy John Sanders has a new book out called Embracing Prodigals. that is hands down, I think, the most accessible, best account of why authoritative religion is, it's eradicating Christianity from evangelical churches. And it's distorting the gospel of Christ. And so I'd recommend people take a look at that, because what it looks like to be nurturant relative to God, as opposed to authoritative relative to God, suddenly you can see, oh, well, yeah, the wrongdoer is punished and the right people are empowered. And this is why you don't compromise and talk to people who are on the other side. And this is why it's all about obedience and loyalty. It's not about, this sort of developmental relational engagement. Well, it's not surprising then that so many were willing to fall in line with Trump and eviscerate their Christian commitments, because it turns out they weren't eviscerating them. They were just coherently living into what they thought Christianity was, as developed in a 40, 50 year intentional history of white power structures being deployed as the core of what the Word of God is. So John kind of unpacks this and shows this, and it's really surprising stuff. And I actually teach it in my secular philosophy religion classes as a way of inviting my students from whatever background religiously to understand the almost sociological dynamics that would give rise to these hermeneutic distinctions that they don't understand, but they live out. Right. Why is it that I hate those people so much? It's not that I hate Christianity. It's just, man, like, they understand themselves this way, and therefore I'm the enemy. I'm the problem. Right. So yeah, Embracing Prodigals, in stores now. Check it out.
Man, this is good. I'm like forcing you to be a theologian. We're gonna get you a title change. No, I mean, all that to say, hey, sometimes sitting by the Sea of Galilee with Jesus and just soaking it in could be the absolute best thing for all of us. It's not about the church that came later and the power and the whatever. It's like, hey, sometimes you're just kind of, that guy's, you don't even understand it all. You're just kind of you're on that shore, just listening, trying to soak in some wisdom and just figure out what this life's about. And
as a Pentecostal, my pneumatology and my theology are still always going back to the criterion of Christology. So if my notion of God doesn't look like Jesus, something's wrong with it. Right. Because it's probably now just Greek metaphysics. Right. If my conception of relational spirited living doesn't look like Jesus, then it's probably just reinforcing my own conception of entitled ease relative to middle class whiteness. And this is why I often say that if I were invited to give a sermon, which I do not do, I would title it, either God is trouble or God is nothing.
Wow.
So either God is troubling for our conceptions of God.
Yes. Yep.
As reflective of our own social status, or God is nothing but a reinforcer of that social identity. Right. And Lewis has this great line somewhere where he says that he'd rather spend one day with a Greek peasant than to spend a year with all the Homer scholars in the world.
Right.
And I'm like, that's right. I'd rather spend 10 minutes walking with Jesus than spend, 2 years at the evangelical seminaries. Right. And sadly, I think what that would maybe show me is that, Jesus probably wouldn't feel very comfortable in the churches that are the most combatively defensive about protecting his name. And so I tend to be very non-confessional. I'm actually antagonistic to confessional philosophy. Because I think what it ends up doing is, again, starts where we should be ending. But man, I'm a fan of personal philosophy, which is saying we're all starting from somewhere, unless we can let those stories be part of why we're committed in certain ways and where our questions really lie and how it is that we're narrating certain periods in our lives. I don't think that what we're doing is genuine. It ends up being an academic exercise. And part of, again, if you're going to go mountain biking and trout fishing and hiking and stuff, you ain't got time for academic exercises. You do academics so that it matters that we spend our finitude well.
Yeah.
Right. And what will you do with your finitude is a question that not enough of us ask each other, because we assume we already know. You get a job, you get married, and of course heterosexually, and then you're going to have usually 2 or 3 kids. And like we know these things, and then eventually you'll buy a boat and then you'll retire. Right. And you're like, well,
right.
Maybe that's an option.
Mm-hmm.
It's also an option to say, look, that's not how I have to define my life. And, you know, the great communion discourses of Kierkegaard, where he reflects on the invitation of Christ, you know, come all who are heavy burdened and I will give you rest.
Mm-hmm.
You think, man, do we think that the church right now, as reinforcing a particular model of late market capitalism, is giving rest to people? Not saying go make more money so you can prove that you're actually worth something in this world. Instead of saying, you know, money isn't human dignity, right? And if suddenly we now are not welcoming immigrants, and we're not hospitable to the poor, and we're not finding ways to rethink social structures so that healthcare is not something that you're having to choose to eat or get treatment.
Yeah, no doubt.
Like, you know, or global vaccine distribution, that's a Christian issue.
Yeah.
Because it's a human dignity issue.
That's good.
But yet when you say we, us, me,
right.
Well, that's about authoritative religion that says we're the ones who've done it right. We Christians.
Yeah.
They messed it up. Hey, this is my, you know, you're like, nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. So let's talk God and the Other quick. So you write this book. It's been about a decade.
Yeah.
You write a book called
my first single author. Yeah.
God and the Other. I mean, let's just, you know, it's good. It's really good. And I mean, it's
not for everybody. It is not
it's not.
Popular, accessible book, I got to say.
It's difficult to go through. I mean, and so, you know, the other thing is that it also probably led to that kind of phenomenology work, which, you know, in terms of you being able to break down a sort of new phenomenology, French philosophers basically come out and are able to wrestle with the things in postmodernity and come up with a sort of way forward. So that's kind of your second book. Talk about this first book a little bit. You know, just one quick snippet here. It says, you know, you're talking about Putnam and you're talking about the importance of trying to help other people as a requirement of ethical theorizing. And you're basically talking about the ways in which continental philosophy may kind of lead to a sort of systematization of ethics. But in some ways, you're kind of arguing the other way around. Like it's our commitment to other individuals, our commitment to each other as a global community should be kind of the first. And then we kind of go to make the world a better place. And yeah, maybe we come up with a system later, but we have a commitment to look at each other as Imago Dei.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Here I'm following depending on how you want to read it, a French philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who is also notoriously difficult to read. I'm appropriating Soren Kierkegaard's ideas here of what it means to engage in works of love. And I'm also trying to think seriously about what it means to say, love God and love your neighbor. And that's the totality of like Christian life. Like, how could we pull all that together somehow and yet pull it together in a way that doesn't require someone to be a Christian or identify as Christian to see this as who we are as the beings that we are, right? And so it's more a theory of what I call, I'll say it technically and then make sense of it, an ontology of constitutive responsibility. And all that means is who we are is defined as responsible before we are aware of ourselves as free. So look, I'm a classical liberal, like I would say, in fact, all conservatives and progressives both are in various ways. I'm a fan of human freedom. I think the Ukrainians are fighting for this, and it is a moral fight that they are fighting. No one reasonably, in my opinion, could defend less freedom as a model of human flourishing. However, what we mean by freedom has gotten distorted as I don't have to give a crap about who you are or what you do or how my living impacts you. And this is what we saw in the quote unquote debates. I would just say noise of people arguing that their freedom was constricted by wearing a mask. I'm like, well, wow. then you don't understand freedom as a concept, because they're understanding freedom as a possession that some people have and other people, well, they just didn't work hard enough to get it. So sucks for them. And I'm saying, no, my deep, abiding, like almost million conception of freedom, which is like sacrosanct and overrides any quantitative way of trying to debate human policy.
Yeah.
Freedom is anchored, I believe, following Levinas and Kierkegaard and others. It is anchored in a notion of I am responsible to and for all the others. Now, you can see why this is going to be an unproductive political party platform. Right? Yeah. Because wait a minute, if I'm responsible for all the others, does that mean that then I'm just taxed at 100% and they get my house? I mean, does that just mean now that citizens don't have any sort of special stat? Like, you can see where this would become super difficult in the space of policy. And all the thinkers who kind of hold these views say, yeah, it does. But that messiness should not make us shy away from the commitment that our policy is the best we can do to enact maximal freedom in light of abiding and unlimited responsibility. And, think about what our conversations might look like, right? All right, if I am defending, say, universal masking, and you're defending, no, masking's a choice. Well, we've got two different views on a policy question. The question for me and the important issue is not that we disagree about that. It's are we both responsible to our social others, to our neighbors? Are we responsible by taking seriously publicly available evidence that we then can recognize across our policy differences? Right? In other words, do we take science seriously?
Right.
Well, if it turns out that science is cutting very much in favor of mask reducing spread, that doesn't automatically mean that we are public mask mandate defenders.
Sure.
It might just mean that we're recognizing, hey, this is something science supports, but does it come at too high a cost?
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Relative to freedom and respect. There were real mental health crises, especially in teenagers, right? As a result of isolation and social distancing. Maybe that's too high a cost. Sure. So it's problematic to think that the people who disagree with you on policy are automatically evil.
Right.
But we should also not only be committed to evidentiary standards that can be shared, we've also got to be committed to ideals toward which our policies are directed that are shared. In other words, hey, the reason that you might support not having a mask mandate is because you think that, in fact, it's less likely to cultivate a public awareness of shared responsibility because lots of people will feel like they're being forced to do something and it actually psychologically backfires. So in the name of actually getting people to wear masks, your view might be, we've got to minimize the spread of this disease. And the best way to do that is not mandate this, but actually invite people to kind of live into and rise into their responsibility that is chosen. Somebody else might say, yeah, but people don't do it, right? We're going to have to force them, just like we do when it comes to vaccines for, measles, mumps, and rubella. So notice, I'm just trying to show a debate that I think is unambiguously, you mandate masks. And yet, what this God and other idea is about is recognizing we can have these disagreements, but what we can't have is radical division on what even counts as evidence.
Right.
We can't have radical opposition on what it is we're trying to do. The disagreement's got to be about, well, how is it that Bernie Sanders and David Brooks can disagree about the best way to achieve something like human flourishing in light of our abiding responsibility and maximized freedom. And that's what that book's trying to do. But again, it does it by engaging in very technical debates about like Levinasian readings of Kierkegaardian faith.
But that's all good stuff to get into. And like I said, source text, man, like do the reading. This is good reading. And
I hope that's helpful though, right? Because, it always disappoints my conservative friends. That's a weird way to put it, but they get disappointed when I point out to them, hey, the obviousness that you think about, that's the danger. And then my liberal friends get just as angry when I say the obviousness with which you hold the view, that's the philosophical problem.
Yes.
I agree with my liberal friends when it comes to policy. I disagree about the obviousness of those commitments, which allows me to still talk to more conservative friends. And yet there are points where the conversations can't continue, where I'm saying, hey, you know what, conservative friend, you've decided to not care about evidence anymore. You are no longer responsive to reason giving. So therefore there is no reason to continue engaging you as a reasonable member of society. But I've not excluded you. You've decided to disengage from the context where taking each other seriously as members of society, you got to be here, and you're not here.
So. Well, no, I think that commitment to not necessarily just, you're not just launching grenades in a trench to try and get your point across. And I think that is one of the most, that's a philosophical compliment. I mean, we have to agree on terms. We have to decide what the values are. There are arguments on both sides. Maybe they're not necessarily good or all the same weight or whatever, but I think that you're at least laying it out in a way that's helpful. God and the other, help us out with a little bit. So the term phenomenology for the average person, my goodness, what in the world? And so I have a little bit of a heads up, and then I was able to take some courses on Kant, and then maybe some of the fallout from kind of his division of the nomenon and the phenomenon. Right. What is phenomenology, and what's the new phenomenology? What is that second book up to?
Yeah. So I just wrote a really cool paper, I think, with a friend of mine named Amber Bowen. And what we did was tried to introduce phenomenology to students of biblical studies. And so it required us basically to say, all right, if you don't have a background in Heidegger and you've not done your Kant and Hegel classes, and what is this thing? So what we argue there, and then also this is the backdrop conditions of the book, New Phenomenology. Phenomenology is an attempt to say, we are not asking initially about what is the case, right? What is true about the world. What we're asking is, how is, whatever the case is, how is that experienced? So we're not saying, is there a tree in the yard, right? We're asking, well, what does it mean to experience that there's a tree in the yard, whether or not there is, right? I could be high, I could be hallucinating, I could be dreaming. There's all kinds of things that might put question marks about the veridical nature of what I think I'm experiencing, but the experience has its own quality.
Yes.
And we can see why this might be important, because when we talk about experience, the focus is, it's still about the world, but it's the world in the only way that it is ever conveyed to us, namely as experience. So think about, like, what if we in church asked ourselves the following questions? Instead of, am I preaching the gospel, right? Which is an important question for a pastoral ministry team to ask. But notice that's then nested in questions of hermeneutics about, well, how do we understand what the gospel counts as, and well, in what interpretive tradition, and but instead of asking, am I preaching the gospel, what they might ask is, what is likely to be the experience of what is preached today if, in fact, a transgender person walked in the back? What is likely to be the case for somebody who's non-white experiencing the content of what is being preached today? And when we start asking those questions, it allows us not just to be woke, right? It allows us to recognize there is no non-perspectival embrace of reality. So it doesn't throw out objective truth. All the fans of God Is Not Dead movie series can still defend and chest thump about objective truth. What it says is, but objective truth is only ever something that I am affirming from a subjective location in a context and a community and a body. So let's take bodies seriously. Let's take contextual location seriously. So what it does, in my opinion, is phenomenology resituates our questions about not just what is true, but what is my experience of what I think is true. And then it opens us on to hermeneutics.
Yep.
And hermeneutics is just a fancy word for different ways of making sense of the world. So when we are phenomenologically aware, it doesn't make us subjectivists or relativists in a bad sense. What it does is it makes us humble enough to say, wow, there are some experiences that might be shared across all human beings with the bodies that define humanity. For example, another good book by my buddy John Sanders called Theology in the Flesh. He'll talk about the idea of, think about our metaphors we use for God. We need to see God face to face. That only makes sense because we're not jellyfish. Right? Like if we were, we won't have faces. So the very idea of being face to face with God, the idea of saying, we will meet Jesus in the air during rapture, in this sort of dispensational tradition I come from. Well, notice that means good is up. And where is hell? It's below, right? So now we have this narrative of height that is bodily interpreted such that tall people are privileged in certain ways. And isn't that kind of how our world works, right? Taller equals better. Well, that's actually anchored in our theological language about an embodied relation to heaven and hell as spatial. So those things might be pan-human, but there's a lot of stuff that's not pan-human and is nested in our very individual embodied histories. This is like why a book like The Shack, right? Regardless of what somebody thinks of the theology, it's really cool because it embodies the three persons of the Trinity in ways that cause us to rethink what if we've been traumatized or abused by our fathers, and yet we continue to have a white male pastor talk about God as Father? That may not be as productively invitational. But what if God's the big, African-American woman sitting on the porch, rocking in a rocking chair, right? Despite the stereotype that's being deployed even in that idea. Well, maybe that's now opening up and breaking down some of these experienced frames of how we then access our conceptions of the divine and others. So that's what phenomenology, I think, opens onto. Now, as a professional, again, it becomes a very, very, very technical discourse about different ways of bracketing certain, theoretical assumptions and focusing on transcendental notions of consciousness and how we make sense of immanent streams of experiential lived reality. I think all of that stuff, again, is like, that's best left to professionals. But why should the pastors in the pulpit care about phenomenology? Because it helps them say, but what if I'm not a mother because I just lost my child, and yet I'm up here talking about Mother's Day? I bet that's experienced differently, right? And so it wrecks our assumptions about there's just an experience of the world. And it allows us to appreciate the diversity of embodied access to the world.
It's good. Well, and so by way of segue, there is actually a researcher at Birmingham doing a phenomenology of the altar call, which I think is fascinating. And so Wolfgang Bondy is, I'm not sure if that might be Daniela Augustine, but somebody's overseeing that project, and that's pretty cool because that's kind of, it's taking what you're doing and then also going, hey, Pentecostalism and that tradition is an embodied reality, and we know that firsthand. I mean, I grew up in it, you grew up in it, so let's pivot there real quick. So And this is kind of the focus of the podcast. And it's also, as a philosopher, you've kind of taken a different route than a lot of the tradition has, right? Like Pentecostalism is and was and maybe forever will be about saving souls and revivals and pneumatology and in specific ways and tongues and manifestations, all that stuff. How did you end up on that track? And like, I mean, what were your initial impressions? Like, were you turned off by it? Were there things you really appreciated about it looking back? Like, let's go there. I want to hear about your experience.
No, it's good questions. The way you frame that is interesting because it sounds agential, right? It sounds like there was this decision to be here. That's false. In my case, I'm
You didn't just sit in a room like Descartes and figure out that you were going to be a philosopher? Okay.
It was my Pentecostalism. I'm a fourth generation Pentecostal. My grandpa was a pastor in the Church of God. Both of my parents were professors at Lee University, Church of God institution. I was, as they say, teethed on the Redback hymnal. I learned to play drums. I was a professional studio session player for a long time. I learned to play drums playing in altar calls that would go forever at youth camps, right? My single most important social interaction that formed my identity as a kid and teenager was children's church and youth group. Youth choir trips were, again, like that was the summer plans were going on trips, right? I mean, it was never a thing that I thought about or reflected on. It was who I was. It was the lens by which I made sense of the world. I did not reflect on Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is what let the world be available to me. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. But it's what it is. And I think for a lot of people, our relationships to Christian traditions, especially in denominational contexts in America, they are the hermeneutic lens. They're not a hermeneutic option that we reflectively decide upon. Right. But then, I went to Lee University, again, Church of God school, went there to be a physicist. And played drums, toured all over the world playing drums with ministry groups. And then something started to happen that I was very blessed by. So I never was acquainted with or experienced the anti-intellectualism of Pentecostalism that somebody like Mark Knoll diagnoses very well. That was not part of my experience. And the reason for this is I was blessed to be a Pentecostal who had professor parents. Right. My grandfather, pastor grandfather, he was not, the kind of, because I say so and the Bible is clear. He was the calling that when he was retired and fully blind, he was calling the pastor on Sunday afternoon to challenge his interpretation of the Greek. I grew up sitting, in the living room, listening to the adults talk, again, not theology in professional ways, but in these kind of lay spaces, but people who were smart and reflective and philosophically inclined, but in that everyday sense. That was always my experience. And so when I got to college, what started surprising me was the fact that so few of my fellow Lee University attending peers had that kind of background. Right. It was, now again, some did, but more often what I would find, and those tended to go into theology, and they had amazing faculty in theology at Lee, and were getting challenged by Terry Cross and Dale Coulter and Emerson Powery and others who were there. That was a thriving space. But the problem was, more often than not, what I was experiencing were people who, they were sure of where they stood and why they stood and why anywhere else to stand was on its way to hell. And then when you were me and you asked questions, and you, again, not because you were wishy-washy, but because you were like, but wait a minute, but couldn't you also, it was, dude, I once had somebody tell me I had the spirit of witchcraft because I was, quote, too critical. And this was at 19 while talking with people on the back of a choir bus, reflecting on things about, wait a minute, when Abraham goes up the mountain in Genesis 22 and he tells the servant, we will return to you. Should we put emphasis on the we as his knowledge that Isaac would come back? Or was this just him kind of saying, hey, we'll be right back, as a way of just keeping the servant hey, you stay here, we'll be back.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Should we wait? That was the conversation. And I was like, y'all, it's not clear. This is a legit question. And what do we mean by Abraham's knowing here? I wasn't a philosopher. I was just a 19-year-old who had grown up around smart people who loved God and asked questions.
Yep.
And it was like, you are too critical. Blah, blah, we rebuke. And I was like, well, okay. Right. or the time that a buddy of mine and I, this is probably a bad thing to admit, may have paintballed some of the people in our choir's vehicles. And the next day we got to choir thinking, this would be sort of fun. Again, we're freaking college kids, right? Doing stupid stuff. And it washed off. Again, there was no vandalism in bad senses.
Yeah.
But there was somebody, I remember, who stood up in the choir and said, the choir is being attacked by Satan. And this is a spiritual attack. And our cars were targeted. And my buddy and I are in the choir going, wait a minute, shoot, are we devils? Right? So when you start experiencing that, and then to make it serious, when I've got a brother who has juvenile diabetes, type 1, and he's told by people in the college, the reason you're not healed is because you don't have enough faith. Mm-hmm. And then when you see sexual assault and abuse be covered up, and again, I'm not accusing administration of Lee, I'm saying the church more broad, right? Mm-hmm. When you see this stuff in sort of national ways, eventually you start saying, wait a minute, my Christianity doesn't feel like it's at stake. But the way that this is assumed feels shaky. And for me, that's where philosophy started opening up, right? Because philosophy was giving me the tools to wrestle with, I'm not leaving Christianity, but man, living into the Christianity I've been taught by my smart parents and reflective grandpa and grandma and evangelist uncles and on it, like, living into that means maybe I need to be oppositional to some of what I'm seeing in the community that is taking it for granted. So that's where my becoming a philosopher was, in my case, never at odds with my being a Pentecostal. It was an outgrowth of it. The problem was when I went to my theologian professor who taught intro to philosophy at college, and I said, hey, this is it. Like this is, it's allowing me to feel vibrantly invested again. And why don't we have a major in philosophy? He said, well, because we don't want to make atheists. And I was like, and it get the we's. He was like, the board of directors, right? The trustees don't want to make atheists. And I was like, so we're not really invested in learning and thinking and reflection. We're invested in protecting the power structure of this particular notion of God that reinforces our obliviousness to the suffering, trauma, and abuse of others. I don't want that. But notice my rejection of that wasn't a rejection of Christianity. It was in the name of the Christ who I had been taught.
That's good.
Right. So that's kind of how they sort of blended. The question would be, if I could flip the question you asked me, why did I stay Pentecostal? It's like, so why didn't I go become an Anglican or an Episcopal or Presbyterian USA? Because I started sliding more liberal in my commitments to the marginalized and neighbor love and climate change and immigrants and poverty. It was like, wow, being a Christian is pulling me there. Away from the culture war nonsense I was seeing on the right, which again was just reinforcing a notion of identity that I thought was at odds with the widow, the orphan, and the stranger we're called to love in Amos and Micah. And interestingly, the reason I stay Pentecostal is not because, speaking in tongues is whatever, or I stay Pentecostal because the phenomenological reality of an inspirited world where God is relationally invested in our embodiment. I have seen no Christian tradition as lived take that up. Now, this is not a slight on another tradition. This is not a compare. It's just in my experience, what I was raised in, what I was familiar with, it just resonated there. It was like, wow, this is why William Seymour and Amy Semple McPherson, and for all of their flaws, but this is why Black dudes and women were like the leaders of this stuff, because it was about an embodied relation to a God who is relationally embodied. man, yeah, I'm in here. And so it was a theological commitment that I reaffirm daily. But as a result of the postmodern deconstructive philosophy that I do as a professional, anchored and motivated by the experienced growing up in the churches that I didn't choose. So my choices now are based on the philosophical commitments that grew out of the lived reality that wasn't chosen.
Sure.
So I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but that's
a great answer.
How I would.
And the other thing is, there is something to be said about remaining in any tradition, even if you have qualms, even if you have questions. I think that, hey, there's a tendency in our culture to just be like, and I'm out with everything, and I, you know, and that sort of inductive, world-shattering thing, and we don't have time to get into deconstruction, all kinds of other things, but there is something to be said about just trying to make the spaces that you're in better, and ask questions and stay there. And I think that's okay. That's kind of where I'm at in the sense that, we've had different life journeys, but you know, the Pentecostal tradition has so much potential to emancipate individuals at many levels, whether they be social, whether they be within religious spaces. There is a sort of empowerment, not just via the Holy Spirit, but what that tradition can and should mean in terms of things like music, preaching, expression, self-expression, psychology. There's a lot of depth to it that I don't think is appreciated by, let's just say, I'll just name one tradition that doesn't appreciate it. A lot of Reformed Baptists just don't like it. They don't like Pentecostals. And I get it. And it's kind of funny because, hey, I've learned from other Christian friends. I've been able to kind of embody and listen to those voices. But I will just say, at the end of the day, I came to the point where I'm going, am I something else? Am I just this, or just this Christian, or just whatever? And I think you're right. Phenomenologically and in terms of history, you just go, this is a part of who I am. It just is. These assumptions, there's nothing wrong about that. There's nothing bad about that. If this experience, if Pentecostalism can be changed for the better, if it can ask bigger, deeper questions, this is a pretty cool place to be from too. It has its own, it's got a lot of weird quirks.
It's got its own issues,
theological errors and issues. And I haven't really gone into those, but, anything that you can just say as an insider in terms of being a philosopher, what are the dangers? I mean, I haven't gotten into that in the podcast. We'll get there later, but just help me out with what the dangers are from this tradition.
No lived human praxis is not going to be tempted to become human, all too human. And I should say, one of the things that, continues to attract me to Pentecostalism is the fact that, like, again, I'm a drummer. Like, the music's just better. But by better, I can hear one of my friends who's a church organist in a high church. He's like, it's trash, right? Yeah. And I'm like, because he was raised in a space where what church meant and what excellence looked like was Handel's Messiah with a 200 voice choir. And I'm like, I don't know. That sounds a lot like school to me. I mean, if you can't dance, like, So it's like, I don't want to go to church to listen to NPR. That's not my background, right? Right. So that embodied affect, which I find resonating with me, that I think opens on to all this promise about a concern for embodiment and attention to embodiment. Liberationist theology and womanist theology resonates deep in my bones almost, right? Because it too is about this kind of, what does it mean to live this? So I think in many ways, the good is also what opens up the temptation to excessive trouble. And it looks like this to me. You start thinking, but that's not what Christian music should sound like, because this is what my church does. And of course, this is what maybe the Reformed Baptists think about the Pentecostals. It's also what the Pentecostals are thinking about everybody whose churches are boring. I have no problem saying it just bores me, but that's not a theological claim, right? Like, I'm bored by pop music. I think it sucks. I got students that think I'm an absolute idiot because I think Taylor Swift's overrated, right? And the fact that I prefer Ryan Adams' cover of, her track, like they think, oh, how horrible, of course, because you're just a white dude. And it's like, well, maybe I'm aware that maybe, but I think it's also just because, man, like the way he does it has a different kind of feel. Doesn't mean it's better. Just like I'm there, right? I like extreme heavy metal. My wife thinks it's just the devil yelling at her and wanting her to have a headache. And I'm like, oh, it's so good, right? I'm all into Ukrainian black metal right now because I'm like solidarity. I don't know what to do. I can listen to 1914 and Ginger all day long, right? And I'm posting this, and my dad emails me today. He's like, Aaron, you need to be careful. Like, some of this stuff just doesn't reflect well as a professional scholar. And I'm like, yeah, that seems right. I get that. Because his model of professionalization is not heavy metal and throwing horns in the air.
Right.
So the dangers of Pentecostalism are not unique to Pentecostalism, I don't think. They are just exacerbated because one of the goods of Pentecostalism is a focus on affective embodied style. Right. And I say this in one of my articles on Pentecostal philosophy, that we should care about not being boring as philosophers as part of what it means to do Pentecostal philosophy. Right. If you can't, think about it. When I think church music, I don't think Hillsongs, right? Which is not Pentecostal. That's evangelicalism, which I think is horrid and makes God angry. But it's a joke. David, come on now.
I
hate Hillsongs. But the idea is, it's not that's what I'm saying. Like for me, it's running bass lines, like, walking bass lines and B3 organs and backbeat double stroke. Like, for me, the no. And then you start seeing the whole place start. For me, wow. Yes. That's not something I think is closer to God.
Right.
And that's the temptation, is to have the pastor who is vibrant and enthusiastic and charismatic. And that is not closer to God.
Yes. That's good.
And I was once interviewed at a church. I was going to play drums at this church, and it was a big kind of non-denominational evangelical sort of thing. And they interviewed me, but they were Pentecostal, but it was kind of really Pentecostal understood as this kind of, like Baptists who got the Spirit, quote unquote. And so they then became like this charismatic evangelical sort of space, but no broader affiliation with a Pentecostal tradition that anchored them in theological history.
Sure. Yeah.
And they asked me, they said, we see that you definitely are somebody who lives in the life of the mind. We don't see the life of the Spirit in you. And I said, well, what would that look like? And they said, well, you are reflective and intentional and smart, but we just don't see the kind of quick fire of the Spirit. And I said, well, your obsession with like God's being quick and speak probably is just capitalism. It probably isn't Christianity. And the idea that you think the Spirit is manifest with gold dust and jumping and shaking and that's probably just idolatry, because I see the Spirit more in the little 17-person Presbyterian church who make sure that no one is going without food in their mile of the world.
Wow.
That's the Spirit for me, right? So that's not an either or. Like, I'd rather be addressing poverty while also having cool music. Right?
Yeah.
But the biggest worry I have about Pentecostalism as a contemporary manifestation of denominational practice is it is not much more anymore, not much more than just white American evangelicalism with a little bit more verve to their music and embodied expression. But having a coffee shop and a really amazing light show does not make you somehow understand the radical logic of kenosis that challenges our economic model of human dignity that is right now becoming American Christian nationalism rather than what we are opposing in the name of Christianity that would eschew any conception of nationalistic fervor. So that it's the thing that is rocking about it, man. That is the thing that I think is undermining its good. It's where we say, wait a minute, we want to celebrate Azusa Street, but we don't want to stand with Black Lives Matter for racial justice. Aren't we past that now? Because we don't want it to be difficult to be embodied in social spaces. We want it to be just rocking.
Yeah.
Right. We're cool celebrating Foursquare gospel and Amy Symbol Free. But what we're not cool with is letting women take the pulpit and the men shut up. Right. We're still preaching, nonsense complementarian garbage while we're also trying to celebrate true equality. And there is neither Greek nor Jew. And that's the stuff that I find just trash theology mixed with American individualism and spit out as authoritarian conceptions of a God who is the whole time in Pentecostalism saying, y'all, it's because you are relationally embodied that I am relationally engaged.
Yeah, that's good.
And so that's where I think Pentecostalism is not for everybody because it is likely to be very off-putting to people who are concerned about the bodies of the marginal others, not just the bodies of the people dancing in the pews.
Right.
And that, I think, is a real missed opportunity that we've got to fix.
Well, and the other thing I will say to that point is that all of the pictures of the past don't show all the work that went into some of this as well. So, right, we just think of these like larger than life figures and these cool events, and Azusa Street was just this rock show, whatever. I mean, we don't see that Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. the dude woke up and started, maybe started baking bread for feeding people that night. Angelus Temple used to feed like 100,000 people. I mean, there's a lot of social gospel in this movement. One of the projects that I'm really I think is important is just tying this movement to not just larger revivalist movements, which it is a revivalist movement that did come out of, some of the stuff that happened in Scotland, certainly with the Welsh revival and other things in Cane Ridge in Kentucky and all these, I mean, it is a sort of, grandchild of those movements, but as well, it definitely came out of 19th century social gospel concerns. And it would be way less potent and way less cool. I probably wouldn't be in on it if it wasn't for that kind of, wow, this is something that takes a bunch of, it's a folk religion, right? Like these are just people. They don't have pretense. They don't have titles. They don't care. They just have nothing, and they just get together and can celebrate the goodness of God in the midst of that, and come up with some good music, and come up with some, and be roused to do good. To it's very Wesleyan in a lot of ways because it's hey, do good. Feel that spark of the Spirit, like have your heart strangely warmed. That is one of the
awesome democratized. Again, I keep saying the word canonic because I think we don't talk about it enough. But that democratized canonic come all that Pentecostalism was at its root has somehow now become right-wing populism. Which is anti-elitist, right? Somehow that crossing, which again, I wrote a book I never published trying to track all of this and how it unfolded. So it's not that I'm just thinking somehow like, who knows? I actually have a view on this.
Sure.
But the idea is somehow we let that happen, right? Yeah. And the we here, man, there's some good voices starting to say, nah, we need, the Louis Olina, the, Bill Oliverios, the Amos Youngs, the Daniela Augustines, like there's a lot of people. William Barber, he's a Pentecostal. So part of what we're also talking about is primarily white Pentecostalism. Like the Black Pentecostal churches also, Church of God in Christ. My wife and I attended a Cogic church for several years.
Sure.
That's a different space.
It is,
where the embodied concern for the marginalized is activated as why we get together.
Definitely.
Right. The idea that the church is the space where Black bodies were empowered and allowed to hold titles and names that were not anchored in the slavery model is part of what runs through those churches in ways that is not true in the white evangelical churches that often were becoming who they were as a rejection of that influx of other bodies and other identities. So it's important, again, when we talk about this, to be careful to say, Pentecostalism. Well, notice we're also talking primarily American, right? We're not talking about the global South where Pentecostalism is booming. It's booming, and it has a different flavor, and it affects, Pope Francis has a very Pentecostal Latin American liberationist vibe in what he's up to. So when the first thing he does is washes the feet of a Muslim woman after becoming Pope, that foot washing's a Pentecostal move, man. Like that's how my mom used to punish us when we'd be mad at my brothers. I still hate feet as a result, dude. So the idea of saying, wow, when we're being critical, when we're being, we've also got to recognize that there's a invisible privilege that can happen when we say Pentecostal. We just mean, what goes on at our predominantly white Pentecostal churches in America. And I am guilty of that because that's my experience. That's where I grew up. Those are primarily the churches that I attended. And so then when you start saying, when I dig into the history of Pentecostalism, it isn't that. It is complicated and dynamic and plural and global. And, it's the poor in West Virginia and Tennessee that are really giving rise to something that's going to change the world. It's not the wealthy dudes hanging out, at some big rock star church. And they were oppressed and their churches were burned. Like there's an interesting solidarity that emerges in the first couple decades of the 20th century between the experience of early Pentecostals in the mountains and what non-whites were having to endure at the hands of white supremacy. And so no wonder there started being some interesting intersection and overlap. But let's not forget that William Seymour, as a Black man, had to sit in the hallway in seminary because he wasn't allowed in the room where the white Pentecostal, quote unquote, was delivering his talk. So if we don't own that exclusion, and this is where I would say, if we aren't engaged in a critical race theoretical conception, we are abdicating the social responsibility for owning the history that has made us who we are. And sadly, too many white Pentecostal evangelicalized Americans are running around trying to erase the history that would give rise to a critical resourced tradition that allows us now to say, we were not, as Kimberly Crenshaw talks about, we were not a country that was born perfect and only got better. Right. This is not a tradition that was birthed perfect and got better. It's a tradition that was birthed in trauma because we, like everyone, are human and we are guilty of that kind of social disillusionment that creates often the erasure of the other rather than the invitation to them.
That's good. That is good. So one compliment and one final question. So one thing that I just appreciate about you is you just have an extreme, I think that you have an extremely generous spirit. And I will just say that. And part of why I say that, well, a couple of reasons. One, you met with me in kind of a crisis moment, thinking about some PhD work, and you're quick to not just encourage people, but I think just be generous with your time, be generous with your resources. And I've seen that as secondhand. So you've been extremely kind and generous to someone like Amber Bowen, who is up at Redeemer. Is that right? Redeemer in Ontario. She's a phenomenal scholar.
So good.
And the sky's the limit. I mean, she's good at Kierkegaard. She's really, I mean, she cares about the church. She's in this thing. She's invested. I mean, I just saw the other day, you're like everywhere, man. Yoon Shin is doing a PhD at Aberdeen with
finished it.
Phil Ziegler. Just finished his dissertation in defense. And it's like, man, you're just like blowing life into people that want to ask these kind of questions. And so I just thank you for that, man. I think your students would say the same thing. So I'm not coming up with this. Thank you for being generous with your time and just your life's work. What do you have coming up? What do you hope to tackle in the next 2 decades, man? Where are you headed? We got this trout fishing book coming. What else? How can we link up with your work? What do you hope to tackle in terms of big questions?
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. I tell my son every morning when he goes to school, which thank God he can do again. There was a year and a half where, when I say every time I take him to school, it was like, when I take him to the other room a little bit down the hallway. Thankfully, now he's back at school. And every morning we say to each other, I say, who loves you? He's like, mom and you. And I was like, and what is it that we do not care about? And he says, that I am rich. And I was like, and what do we care about? And he says, that I am kind. And it's important to understand that kindness doesn't mean facile ego stroking, right? I am told probably in ways I should pay attention to, that, I am too intense and whatever. And it's like, man, I hope that that's not overcoming kindness. I hope that what that looks like is what it means to be generous and engaged is also still to be reflective and critically interested, right? Those questions I asked on the back of the bus while touring with that choir in college, that wasn't an attempt to say, I am smarter than these people. It was an attempt to say, y'all, like, we aren't God. And so we should be really aware and do the diligence of thinking well, right? And so it means a lot to me that you would give me those kind words. So let me say one thing about Yun Shen. He just finished his PhD, published a great book I highly recommend on Pentecostalism and Reformed epistemology, just came out. I wrote the preface for it, which I was honored to write. And so, if anybody is looking for a really exciting young scholar explicitly in the Pentecostal space, I would highly recommend Yun Shen. I'd also recommend a guy who's a little bit behind him as far as, finishing. But Spencer Moffitt is a name that very few people know about, but he's up and coming. He's going to be doing some really cool stuff in the next, 5-10 years, I think. Amber's work is amazing from a more reformed space, non-Pentecostal. And she and I, of course, write together now and think together a lot.
Wait, you get along with reformed folks? I mean, come on. We didn't even get into open theism, man. Like, we didn't get into determinism, but no, I'm kidding.
My open theist soul definitely balks at some of her commitments. And when we write stuff together, it's so funny because we'll write and I'll write a section or whatever, and she'll come back and it's got, corrections in it, or revisions in it. And I'm like, Amber, what about, she's like, dude, you're trying to get me fired at a Redeemer. Like, I can't say this, So she and I, navigate what it looks like to say stuff that I can say yes to and she can say yes to, which I think is a pretty cool experience.
That's good.
So what am I up to? I'm on sabbatical right now, which my wife thinks is just Latin for paint the house. But once I get the house painted, what I'm working on now is 3 things. And I hope that they will all be done in the next year or so. And then I'll give you kind of where I think my thinking is going for the next decade. Who knows? I think the 3 books I'm working on, and they're at various stages of completion. One is a technical academic book on postmodern deconstructive philosophy of religion. That is a collection of essays that I've written in various places over the last 15, 20 years. I've never put together a collection of essays, of like going through the stuff I've written and published and pulled together. But when I sat down to write, like, well, what's the next book I need to write in this academic space? It was like, well, it turns out I've written it. It just showed up as like an essay on Kierkegaard and preaching that got published, ironically, in Ukrainian. No one has read that essay. Except some Ukrainians, which I'm thrilled and honored that they thought it was worthwhile. Essays that I've published, that got translated into other languages, and I wrote for this special issue or that special thing, and pulling those together, it turns out I've got a kind of, I think, coherent vision of what postmodern philosophy of religion might involve. And it is broadly termed what I call postmodern cataphaticism, where what it means to be religious in a postmodern space does not mean that we are vacuous or negatively, I know not what kind of stuff.
Right.
We are haunted by the necessity of humility and divine excess, but we are also determinately located in embodied histories and cultural practices that inform the way we make sense of God, ourselves, and others. And pulling these essays together. So there's a big section on Kierkegaard. So I've got stuff on Kierkegaard and Pentecostal philosophy in the book.
Cool.
Essays on Kierkegaard and Simone Weil and Dietrich Bonhoeffer on what it looks like to stand against Christian nationalism in an age of Trump. So, some sort of focused, careful things, but then there's also stuff about like meta theory and what does it even mean to do postmodern philosophy? And why is this an epistemic issue and not really a metaphysical one? And then some phenomenology stuff about like, how then would this speak to different audiences? And so I'm writing an essay right now that will hopefully be part of this book, as well as another one on, phenomenological hermeneutics for pastors. Like, how would they access it? So that book I'm excited about, but I admit it's taking more energy to finish up. It's all written, but I've got to write an introduction and edit it and stuff.
Yeah.
It's taking more energy than I wish it were, just because, to be honest, I'm kind of losing my fire to speak to a bunch of professionals about stuff that we do as professionals.
Sure.
And that's then the second book, which is the Kierkegaard book on, camping and middle age and finding meaning in the face of loss and dealing with aging parents and, kids that don't want to hang out with you. Right? It's, I give you just a little taste of like what I was writing yesterday about this. I'm into mountain biking. And so I bought a new bike, which I'm very excited about. Full suspension Kona Process 134 for anybody who's geeking out with me. And I wanted to wrap the whole thing in race wrap, right? So basically you're wrapping it in vinyl so that then when you run into rocks or whatever, it doesn't tear up the paint. So I was wrapping it. And I was trying to get this piece of vinyl off the backing paper to put on the bottom of the bike. And I mean, I spent 45 minutes, David, and could not get it to come off. I was so angry, kept cutting it, thinking if I do that. And I was like, yelled at my wife, Vanessa, can you help me? Don't you hear me struggling? Right. You're like, come on. So she comes in, she's like, what? And I was like, look, I cannot get this. Can you please help me? Like, I'm getting angry. She takes it. And I mean, 2 seconds later, she says to me, Aaron, this is just backing paper. You've already used this piece.
Wow.
Right.
That's humbling. That's good. That's good.
Like, this book is me using those sorts of experiences to then reflect on, well, what does it look like to live in light of epistemic humility? What does it look like to think about our directional faithfulness only being persistently virtuous if it's a good direction? My persistence in peeling that backing paper, but I was misguided in my direction because it turns out I was dead ending, but I was not going to give up. Well, it turns out I'm just a fool, right? So that book is this kind of thing. And then trying to have some Kierkegaard sort of flavor throughout, and some Aristotle and a little bit of existentialism. And, so that book's a lot of fun. And that's the one that I stay up at night writing because I feel like it's flowing right now. Good. The other one's work. Right.
Sure.
And then I'm doing a book with a buddy of mine, and this one's taken too long to get out, but I say this because it's kind of announcing some directions for me. It's a book tentatively. I'm with a friend who's a personal finance professor, and it's tentatively titled.
You talked about this. Yeah.
Personal Finance for Marxists, Philosophers, and Everyone Else Who Spends Too Much Time at Coffee Shops. That's the book. And what we're doing is, some philosophy, but it's really just a book on personal finance and some general ideas on how do we care about, if what we're going to do with our finitude is the question.
Right.
But we also need to make sure that what we're doing is not having to work 90 hours a week in our 40s to be able, like, maybe we've messed up in the way we understand finitude. Why is it that we live all of our lives so that we can retire well? And then we retire, but we blow out our knee or break our hip and we can't enjoy maybe we can rethink this. Why is insurance something we've got to think about as reflective adults? Why is it that caring for the other means that you're talking about wills, right? Maybe some of that is something we should do in reflective ways, but it's then anchored in Kant's questions. What can I know? What should I do? And for what should I hope?
Yeah.
And so the book has got this philosophical flavor. It's not about getting rich. It's about challenging that wealth determines happiness.
That's cool.
Right. So thinking about that in practical ways, doing that.
Are you guys using, so I got to ask one quick, are you guys using Philip Goodchild's, isn't he over at, he's at
Theology
Nottingham.
of Money.
He's got some really cool stuff. I mean, it's kind of like Jamie's stuff in cultural. It's kind of cool. And like, I don't know if you're using his stuff, but he's got some really cool takes on it. So.
I got to read his Theology of Money when it was still a manuscript draft.
Wow.
And he's doing some really cool stuff. Yeah. It's those sorts of things. Of course, he's writing at a more academic level.
Yeah.
This is what we're trying to do, to be honest with you, is it all emerged from my buddy coming to me and saying, hey, it seems to me that you kind of take this stuff seriously and you kind of geek out about investing and whatever. And not because I care about being wealthy or rich, but because I want to be able to like enjoy fishing, which means I've got to have days to do it, which means I've got to think about, well, how do I live in my 40s now, not just living in my 40s in order to maybe fish in my 60s, right? Like, it's this life thing. And this is all emerging as a result of having worked 100 hours a week for way too many years through grad school and tenure and not fishing and not seeing my son. When it all started, when I was probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, walking downtown with my son at the time, who would have been, I don't know, 6 maybe. And he said, "Dad, I don't want to be a philosopher." And I was like, "Why not? Philosophers are so cool. Woo, right? We're the funnest ever." And he looked at me, he's like, "Nah, Dad." And again, 6 years old or whatever he was, he says, "Philosophers just don't spend enough time with their kids." And when we drove by Furman once, again, about the same age, and we were riding with my mom and dad, and he says, Grandma, that's where Dad lives."
Wow.
So this is not a book coming from, look at my wisdom. This is a book we're trying to write with me saying, y'all, I done effed up. And you know what? Thank God my son is 12 and I am 44 and my wife is still healthy. And like, maybe we can do it better, right? Maybe we can think differently about this stuff. Maybe we can find ways to not think sleeping at the office, which I did for years, is the best way to become someone of significance. Maybe significance just looks differently, right? So that book's fun, but where my kind of thinking is going is, and, you know, I'm not delusional enough to think that people care about this, but I am deeply impacted by the fact that the pandemic revealed a lack of reflective, intentional engagements with living well that are not able to be couched in confessional evangelical book studies or self-help guru influencer nonsense. Like, that's what's out there. Yeah. And so when the pandemic hit and I was stuck at home, like everybody, and trying to figure out how do we deal with this world that's collapsing on us, I reached for Bonhoeffer. Right. Wrestling with his letters and papers from prison. Cause man, like he's dealing with something in isolation that I'm not. Like he might. And I reached for Martin Luther King, talking about what liberation really means, even when it means sacrifice, watching all of my quote unquote Christian brothers and sisters refusing to wear masks and we're not going quietly into the night. And yet you've got King saying, nah, like, come on, pastors, stop being the white moderates standing against real solidarity. I read Simone Weil talking about solidarity with the poor. Right. So I started thinking, man, who's writing this stuff? Now, there are people, don't get me wrong. Yeah. They're I also reached to Anne Lamott. I also reached to Nadia Bolt-Weber videos on YouTube. I also reached to every Sunday listening to William Barber. I also love what, you know, people are doing kind of in some of these public intellectual sort of spaces. But I really felt convicted that at 42, when the pandemic started, I was desperately looking to others to tell me how to live when everybody I was looking to died younger than I was. And I was like, at some point, I've got to find my voice. Yeah. Not because I'm important, but because at some point, what adulting means is that we start not just being reflections of what everybody has told us. And we start saying, you know what, in a life defined by periods, I will be remembered. In a life defined by question marks, I'll be remembered for my periods. Where am I putting those down? And how can I model putting some periods down while the question marks remain? And that's what I don't see enough of. So my hope is over the next 10 years, the things like my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, the public engagement on things like podcasts and you know, video interviews. Like, I'm hoping that sort of space becomes more training for making an audience focus that is broader. Yeah. The goal not being to sell more books, right? And again, in this sort of economic sense, but the goal being maybe I can, again, find a way to navigate my world in ways that invite others to find ways to navigate theirs.
Yeah.
So it's not, here's how you live. Here's your self-help. Here's your 7 steps to a greater you. No. But maybe there are a lot of people who are raising kids or college students wrestling with how to pick a major or what to do with their life, or, whether or not to get married or partner or take whatever it is. Maybe they're facing, I've got a student right now facing the potential death of one of their parents from cancer. I've got another student who just had a kidney transplant and wrestling with what it means to live as vulnerable. Like, maybe that stuff is why we did all the professional work and got good enough at these technical things to then say, hey, I'm not stepping into here as the pro telling you what to do. But maybe as a pro, I can invite you to recognize that we're all a little bit more amateur than we realize. And maybe that's something that can help us, be kinder at the end of the day. Right.
Yeah.
And we'll see what happens. I am not delusional enough to think that I will ever have the kind of following that someone like Tripp Fuller has built for himself, which I am impressed by.
He's
and
a buddy,
jealous
man.
of.
He's just a buddy. He'll have you on anytime, man. He's a huge fan of you. So
that
he
dude
respects you a lot.
Has crushed it. And I keep telling him, I'm like, man, you're trying so hard to become one of us, like to get the professor position, to write the, I was like, people like me and a bunch of others, there's a kind of like, not exodus from professorate, right? We're all privileged to have our jobs. It lets me fish, right? But an exodus from like, what is it that we're doing that matters again? It's inviting adults not to be self-absorbed clowns, right? And we're also trying to speak into a space that needs really good experts who are really good at things like argumentation and hermeneutics and understanding and evidence and assessing debates. We need these experts, and I'm glad to be one of them. But it's also the case that maybe a bunch of us need to start becoming more like Tripp and not think that what real success looks like is becoming able to not to have to talk to, the rabble. Maybe that's what we've got to learn how to do.
It's cool.
And model for the world what it means to say, hey, even though Aristotle was right to say you can't have genuine friends who are less good than you, maybe you should have a lot of friends who find themselves being smart in ways that you aren't, rather than thinking what you are smart in means that your voice is now the one they should default to. And that's the authoritarian nonsense that I think underwrites Putin's aggressive vice. It underwrites Trump's narcissism. It underwrites white evangelical American disregard for the marginal and the poor. And sadly, it underwrites the left's dismissiveness of a bunch of people with whom they share the world out of political disagreements. And somehow we've got to find ways to say, hey, you don't have to compromise where you stand to be able to engage the other in critically reflective ways that still can show kindness. And maybe that will allow us to be better with money, because you realize money doesn't define everything. Maybe we can now find better ways to facilitate time and flourishing and say, hey, you know what? As a business owner, I need to pay my staff more, not because that's the only way I can keep the employees, but because I don't need a second boat. And that one needs healthcare. Like maybe this is just a different value set. But I think that professional philosophers are a really good resource for trying to envision that world.
That's good.
And so I'm going to do my best to try to, lend my voice to that movement and see what we can do.
Very cool. Well, hey, Harvard, I think, has like a human flourishing center.
Human flourishing program up there.
I'm not saying you should head it or move to Northfield, Minnesota and run the library, but there are jobs out there for you. No, there may be, who knows? I mean,
we're open to a bunch of stuff. I admit that right now, which is so, again, difficult to say, and I know some will hear it exactly the wrong way. Despite the trauma of the last 3 years, I've never been happier than I am now as an adult. And the reason is not because things are just all great, right? I've got people I love who are dealing with cancer. I've lost friends this year who have died from COVID. I have personal friends connected to Ukraine in ways that are familially traumatic. We're all in this. And I'm also amazingly privileged because of historical embodied realities and economic like all, I'm not unaware of that. But yet why I'm happier is simply because, you know what, like, it seems to me that spending more time at the office would be the last thing I want to do. And that does not mean, however, that doing philosophy is the last thing. Like, I'm going to do more philosophy. I just might do it while on a trail, pulled over after landing a jump that didn't go very well. And I'm going to be philosophizing. Maybe I can do that in a way that then's inviting other people to think about it. Maybe my flat tire that I busted on a route while casing it might lead to a video that then speaks to a business leader who's struggling to figure out how not to, be overwhelmed by failure. And thinking those things through in reflective ways, I don't know. It's making me happier. It's making me joyful. It's getting me out of my head where what I'm doing is just defending my views. And it's more like, it's not just my views. It's, hey, these are views that maybe we all should think through.
Very cool.
And, I've got a son who gave a talk this morning at his school about why they need to have this new Student of the Week program. And he modeled it for my wife and I last night. And it makes me so happy to say, hey, there's nothing more important that I could do than do that with him. Right. And maybe spending money on buying him his own drill so that he can make stupid fingerboard skateboards, which I think is the dumbest thing that's ever existed. But he's decided that's what he wants. He's going to do that. I'm like, hey, let me go get you a drill so that you can understand what ownership looks like, not in an economic rich sense, but in the sense of making something that matters and putting your effort into something that you think is going to produce something that other people might enjoy. Like, I don't know.
That's cool.
I think philosophy is bigger than we have often made it.
It's cool.
And Christianity is way kinder than we have displayed. And thinking together is harder than we acknowledge. But in the end, says my former mentor, David Kangas, there is the unmanageable, but we'd be trivial without it. And I think that's a pretty good place to find ourselves.
Well, thanks so much, man. Thanks for just sharing your brain and you process stuff in a way that I think is so fun publicly, just because it's like, you just, the way that you go down rabbit holes and then bring stuff in, man. I mean, it reminds me of those awesome first experiences in philosophy at the undergraduate level, which is what you do. And so thank you for bringing me back into that classroom and like the time where you're like, this is really cool. I want to kind of do something like this.
It's such a ball. And what you're doing is, like I say, I see you as a partner in this work. And I know you're trying to, get back in and do a PhD and kind of figure that academic space out. But like I said about Tripp, I hope that works out. And I hope I'll do everything I can, of course, to have your back in that process. But it's also the case that I think more and more and more, we need philosophers and theologians who are brewing beer, like, probably our mutual friend, Josh Patterson, who are thinking reflectively while running music labels, while are doing engineering. I had one of the best philosophy conversations I've had with anybody lately was an electrician who came to fix something on the outside of my house. And he and I spent 3 hours just sitting in my backyard after he finished talking about philosophy. And it turns out dude was a former pro skateboarder, and he's got this skateboard company on the side called Test Skateboards. I highly recommend everybody. And, it's like, man, this is what life really needs to be looking like. And if all we do is think the 9 to 5 and the business card is the goal, we're going to miss having conversations with electricians because we think they're just the labor. Rather than, maybe that guy has something I need to learn about being human.
And
that's good. I think if we can listen, maybe we'll have the ears to hear.
That's good. Well, thanks for joining us today, man.
Hey, boss. It's been a absolute pleasure. I'm a fan of yours. And to all the listeners, sorry for giving you such a long set of debates. But
no
as somebody once told me, if I had more time, I'd make my book shorter. So
exactly. Very good. Thank you.